Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. AI is everywhere these days.
Yeah.
And today we're diving into something really important, AI policy for institutions.
The big one.
It is a big one.
Yeah.
Especially as these AI tools get more powerful and, they're just being used everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So luckily,
More and more.
you brought us this research paper.
Yeah.
It's called Artificial Intelligence Policy Framework for Institutions.
Great paper.
And it's full of really fascinating ideas about how institutions can practically
It is.
use AI responsibly. So
It's good framework.
that's what we're going to be breaking down today.
Yeah, let's get into it.
All right.
Oh,
One of the things that I thought was really interesting right off the bat is how the paper really emphasizes this difference between traditional computers,
Yeah.
AI, and then this new thing that everyone's talking about, generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like they're setting the stage to say,
Yeah.
you can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach to AI policy. You have to think about the different ways that these
Different
technologies are being used.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
When the paper talks about computers,
Mm-hmm.
it's basically referring to anything from a simple electronic device, even a calculator,
Right.
to those supercomputers that are, crunching massive amounts of data.
Yeah, exactly. The whole spectrum of computing power.
So then it goes on to talk about artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
What makes AI different from just a regular computer?
So AI is all about that ability to mimic human intelligence.
Right.
So things like learning, problem solving, and making decisions based on data.
Yeah.
That's what sets AI apart.
Okay. And then there's this new
And then
category, generative AI.
there's generative AI.
GA, as the paper calls it.
Yeah, GA.
So these are the things that everyone's talking about because they can actually create things.
Yeah.
Like write text,
Right.
generate images,
So
even compose music.
it's incredible what it can do.
Right. It's like AI is not just analyzing information anymore.
Yeah.
It's actually producing it.
It's a whole other level.
And I think that's where it starts to get really interesting.
It does.
In terms of policy.
Yeah.
Because how do you
That's true.
govern something
Right.
that's creating things on its own?
Especially when it can be
Right?
so opaque.
Yeah.
That's why the paper emphasizes explainable AI,
Okay, let's talk about that.
especially for generative AI.
Explainable AI.
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
Well,
Especially when we're thinking about
so,
institutions making decisions that could have real impact on people's lives.
it all comes down to trust. Right? Imagine an institution using AI to decide
Mm-hmm.
how to allocate resources or to admit students to a program.
Absolutely.
If we don't understand how the AI is reaching its conclusions, how can we trust those decisions?
So it's not just about AI being accurate.
Right.
It's about understanding how it gets there.
Exactly.
So that we can trust the outcome.
You have to be able to see the why behind the what.
Right.
It's like the paper uses this analogy of electricity.
Oh, yeah.
In the early days, people were afraid of electricity.
They didn't understand it.
Right. They didn't understand it.
Yeah.
And it seemed dangerous and mysterious.
Yeah.
But as scientists and engineers explained how electricity works, demonstrated its safety,
Yeah.
people started to trust it.
Oh.
And then they embraced it.
Yeah.
We need the same thing with AI.
Yeah. We need to be able to look under the hood and understand
Absolutely.
how it's working.
The paper actually highlights some specific algorithms to kind of illustrate this point.
Okay.
So, for example, there's ordinary least squares.
Mm-hmm.
It's very transparent. You can see
Yeah.
the relationship between different variables.
Yeah.
And then on the other end of the spectrum,
You have things like neural networks, which are very powerful,
right.
but often a lot less transparent.
Yeah, those are the black boxes.
Like those black boxes we talked about.
Yeah.
So choosing an algorithm is about more than just its technical capability.
It's about the level of transparency
Yeah.
and whether the institution can actually understand what the AI is doing.
Exactly.
It seems like a really tricky thing to balance.
It is. It is.
But it's not just about explainability.
Yeah.
The paper also talks a lot about
Right.
protecting privacy when using AI, especially in institutions that are dealing with sensitive information.
sensitive information. Absolutely.
Think about all the data that institutions have access to.
Yeah.
Student records, patient information, financial data.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're using AI, you have to be super careful about protecting that information.
Especially when you consider that AI systems often rely on these vast data sets
to function.
It amplifies the potential for breaches.
It does.
Right.
That's why the paper talks about techniques like anonymization and pseudonymization as a way to safeguard that information while still enabling the AI to do its thing.
So it's about finding ways to use data without compromising people's privacy.
Exactly.
Which I imagine is...
It's a really difficult balance.
A really difficult balance to strike.
It's a challenge, for sure.
Especially as these AI models.
Especially as they get more and more complex.
Get more complex?
Yeah.
And they need even more data to function.
And that actually brings up another important point that the paper makes, which is the environmental impact of AI.
Okay.
Especially these really complex models, like generative AI.
Yeah.
They require a lot of computing power.
Right.
A lot of energy to run. So institutions need to be mindful.
It's not just an ethical issue.
Yeah.
It's a practical issue.
It's both.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You have to think about the cost, the environmental cost of running these systems.
And look for ways to make them more sustainable.
So it's really interesting how it's not just the technology itself, but it's how you use it that really determines...
It's about the application.
Whether it's ethical?
Yeah, and the alignment with the institution's mission.
All right. So it has to align with the overall mission and value
of the institution.
Yeah. But how do all these principles actually get put into practice?
Well, that's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
The research paper lays out this really practical decision-making framework. And to illustrate how it works, they actually walk through several hypothetical case studies.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at some of those case studies.
Yeah, dive into those.
Because I think that'll really help to kind of bring these abstract ideas to life.
Absolutely.
All right.
Let's do it.
Okay, so these case studies are really interesting because they show how the framework can be used in these really specific situations.
Yeah, they're great examples.
The first one that caught my eye was this video game studio.
Okay, yeah.
That wants to use AI to make really realistic water graphics. So they're thinking about using a deep learning neural network to do this. And the framework basically guides them through this series of questions to figure out if it's ethical.
Exactly.
The first thing they consider is whether this application involves any sensitive information.
Right.
Because in this case...
That's always the first step.
It seems pretty straightforward that it doesn't.
Yeah, it's just visual effects.
Yeah, they're just making water look more realistic, not using anyone's personal data.
Exactly.
So they move on to the next step, which is whether it could unfairly impact any individuals.
Yeah, does it create any kind of bias or discrimination?
Pretty straightforward that it doesn't. Water is water.
Exactly.
So then they think about the energy consumption.
How much energy is this going to use?
Some of these AI models can be real energy hogs.
They can.
But in this case, they determined that the energy use is relatively low.
Okay. So they're in the clear there.
So far, so good.
Yeah.
And then the final step is to think about the consequences if things don't go perfectly.
Right. What's the worst?
So in this case...
That could happen.
Even if the water graphics aren't that realistic, it's not really a big deal.
No harm, no foul.
It's a video game.
Right.
So based on all of that, the studio feels confident moving forward with the deep learning model.
They've done their due diligence.
And it's a good example of how the framework can actually lead to a positive outcome.
Yeah, it helps them weigh the risks and the benefits.
It also shows how the context really matters.
Yes, context is everything.
What might be okay in one situation
Absolutely.
might not be okay in another.
Right.
And the next case study
Yeah.
really illustrates that.
Okay, what's the next scenario?
This time, it's a university
Okay.
that's dealing with academic honor code violations.
Oh, that's interesting.
So someone proposes using an AI to help process these cases.
To like
predict whether a student is likely guilty or not guilty.
speed up the process.
Yeah, basically to try to make it more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
But the framework
They're always...
prompts them to think about all the potential implications.
Yeah, there are ethical considerations.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So first they have to consider
Yeah.
whether this model would involve any sensitive information.
Right, because we're talking about students' academic records.
Yeah, it's students' academic records.
Which are confidential.
And their futures are potentially at stake.
Absolutely.
And it turns out that the AI model would need to use student ID numbers.
Okay, so that's definitely
So right away,
very sensitive
they're
information.
like, whoa, hold on.
Right. You can't just
You can't just ignore privacy.
throw that data into an AI.
So they consult with the relevant authorities.
Okay.
They put safeguards in place. And they determine that it's okay to use the ID numbers.
Okay.
But only internally.
All right, so they've cleared that hurdle.
But that's just the first step.
There's more.
The framework then prompts them to think about whether the model could unfairly impact any individuals.
Right. Is there any potential for bias?
And this is where it gets...
Because that's...
a really tricky
concern.
Because one of the inputs that the model uses is the student's race.
Whoa. Okay.
And you can see where this is going.
Yeah, that's a major red flag.
You can't use race to predict guilt or innocence.
It could introduce so much bias.
And when they actually dig into the model, that's exactly what they find. They find that the model is disproportionately classifying
races.
Students of certain races
as guilty.
Wow. So even though the model is explainable,
it's explainable.
And they can see how it's making its decision.
They still discovered this bias.
They realize that it's fundamentally unfair.
Yeah, it's not ethical.
And could lead to really discriminatory outcomes.
So what do?
They decide not to use the model.
They scrap it.
They decide that fairness is more important than efficiency in this case.
Yeah, sometimes you have to.
And I think that's a really...
prioritize those ethical considerations.
A powerful example of how...
even over-efficiency.
The framework can help to prevent...
yeah, it can help them.
Some really serious ethical problems.
Avoid some major pitfalls.
Because sometimes the benefits of AI can't come at the cost of fairness and individual rights.
Absolutely. Those have to be paramount.
Okay, I'm ready for another case study.
Okay, what else do they have?
Hit me with another one.
All right. This one is about a specialized medical clinic.
Okay.
That's using AI.
To help diagnose blood cancers.
Oh, wow.
For life or death decisions.
Yeah, the stakes are high.
Yeah, this is serious stuff.
Very high.
So how does the framework...
So how do they approach this?
Guide them through this situation?
Well, the first step is the same.
Okay.
They analyze whether the AI model uses any...
sensitive...
personally identifiable information.
So they find that the model relies on patient health data.
Okay.
But it doesn't use things like names or social security numbers.
So they've de-identified the data.
Yeah, they've taken steps to protect patient privacy.
Good.
But then they have to consider if the model could unfairly impact
certain individuals.
Any individuals.
Right.
And they realize that while they don't directly input race into the model, one of the features that it uses is a specific blood disorder that's highly correlated with certain racial groups.
So even though they're not explicitly using race?
Even indirectly, there's still is a potential for bias.
A potential for bias.
So they dig deeper.
Okay, and what do they find?
And they find that the model is actually really good at explaining how it's making its decisions.
So it's transparent.
So that's a good thing.
That's good.
But then they look at the accuracy of the model across different patient groups.
Okay.
And they find that while the overall accuracy is really high, there is one group of patients where the model performs slightly worse.
And is it?
And it's the patient with that blood disorder that's correlated with
that blood disorder.
It's certain racial groups.
Right.
So there's still this potential for disparity.
That potential for bias.
Even though it's unintentional.
Even if it's unintentional.
So what do?
Yeah, what's the next step?
They decide to move forward with using the model.
Okay.
But they're very careful.
They're aware of.
To make sure that all the medical staff are aware of this limitation.
This potential bias.
So they're not just blindly trusting the AI.
Right. They're using it.
They're using it with caution.
With caution.
And they're interpreting the results very carefully.
Yeah. They're not treating it.
And I think this is another really good example of...
as a perfect black box.
How, even with really careful analysis.
Sometimes
some level of risk is just unavoidable.
There's always going to be some risk.
The key is to manage that risk ethically and responsibly.
Absolutely.
So we've seen how the framework can be applied in these like really different settings.
Yeah, it's versatile.
But I'm also curious about how AI policy plays out in education.
Yeah, that's a whole other...
because the paper emphasizes
ball game
that there are some unique considerations there.
Yeah, in some cases. It might actually be better to limit...
Why would you...
or even prohibit...
limit AI in education?
certain AI tools.
Isn't that supposed to be like this great tool that can enhance learning?
It can, but it's about finding the right balance.
Help me understand this.
Right.
The paper gives an example of a calculus class.
Okay.
Where students are trying to learn these like really foundational math skills.
Uh-huh.
And they're saying that using calculators, which are
a form of AI,
a very basic form of AI,
right,
could actually hinder the development of those skills.
Yeah, because if
you're just relying on the calculator,
rely too heavily on calculators
to solve the equations,
you might not actually understand or learn the underlying concept.
The concept. So it's not about like getting rid of calculators altogether,
right?
But it's about
being strategic,
using them in a way
that
actually supports learning,
that enhances learning, not replaces it.
Does that make sense?
It does.
And they also talk about...
There are other examples, too.
Using GA for writing assignments.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
These tools can be really helpful.
They can be.
For brainstorming or generating ideas.
Yeah, for getting started.
But if students rely on them too much...
If they rely on them too heavily...
They might not actually learn.
They might miss out on...
developing their own voice.
They might not develop their own voice.
And their own critical thinking skills.
Or the ability to, construct a strong argument.
Exactly.
So the paper suggests that instructors should set really clear guidelines. For how GA can be used.
About appropriate use.
And to emphasize that it's a support tool.
Right.
Not a replacement for original thought.
It's not a magic bullet.
So maybe students can use it.
Yeah.
To brainstorm.
For brainstorming.
But they still have to write the final paper themselves.
Yeah, they still have to do the heavy lifting.
So it's about finding that right balance. Between leveraging AI and making sure that students are still actively engaged.
Still learning.
In the learning process.
Yeah, exactly. And this actually applies to instructors too.
Oh, how so?
The paper talks about this professor.
Okay.
Who teaches a graduate history class.
Mm-hmm.
And they're grappling with...
They're trying to decide.
Whether to allow students to use GA for their research papers.
Oh, that's a tough one.
It's a really tough question.
Yeah, because GA can be really helpful for research.
Yeah, it can be.
But it can also be problematic.
So how does the framework guide them through this?
Yeah, how do they decide?
Well, first they have to think about whether using GA in this context would involve any sensitive information.
Right, because that's always...
And in this case...
The first step.
They determine that it doesn't.
Okay.
The types of prompts.
So no privacy concerns there.
The students would be using.
Okay.
And the research topics wouldn't involve any personal data.
So they move on to the next step.
So they clear that hurdle.
Whether it could create unfair disadvantages.
But they have to think about
for any
whether using GA could create unfair disadvantages for some students.
Okay.
And this is where it gets interesting.
Yeah, because they
acknowledge that...
They can reflect biases.
GA, just like any AI system, can be biased.
Yeah, it's trained on data that can contain biases.
There's a risk that GA could generate content.
Yeah.
That's not accurate or fair.
It could perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
Or it could even distort historical facts.
Or present a skewed perspective.
So that's a real concern.
It is.
But the professor also recognizes that at the end of the day...
Students are ultimately responsible.
Students are responsible for what they submit. Regardless of...
Whether they use GA.
Whether they use GA or not. So it comes down
to accountability.
Accountability.
And making sure that students...
Critical evaluation.
You're critically evaluating the information that they're getting.
Yeah. They can't just blindly trust...
So it's about...
the output of GA. Teaching students to be discerning consumers of information.
To think critically.
No matter where it comes from.
About the information.
The professor also emphasizes the importance of proper citation and academic integrity.
Yeah, you still have to cite.
Because GA is a tool.
Right.
It's not a magic wand.
It's not a substitute.
You still have to
do
good research. And you have to cite your sources.
It sounds like the professor is approaching this.
It seems like the professor is...
a lot of caution.
Approaching this with a lot of caution.
But also an open mind.
They're recognizing both the potential benefits of GA, but also the potential risks.
There are definitely risks.
And they're trying to find that.
It's about finding balance.
And one of the things that they also take into account is the fact that a lot of GA tools are pretty opaque.
Kind of a black box.
Like you don't really know.
Yeah, it's hard to tell.
How they're coming up with their output.
No, it's arriving at those outputs.
It's hard to assess their reliability.
You don't know how much to trust it.
Even though the professor is allowing students to use GA, they're really emphasizing the importance of critical thinking and careful evaluation.
Yeah. Don't just take it
at face value.
Don't just trust the technology blindly.
Use your own judgment.
Use it intelligently.
Think critically.
And responsibly.
Absolutely.
And actually, the professor thinks,
and in a way,
that this is a good thing.
This could actually be a good thing.
Because it's forcing students to think,
to develop, engage
those critical thinking skills.
With the information.
It's a valuable lesson.
So it's a valuable lesson in itself. The professor also thinks about the energy consumption aspect.
Okay.
But in this case, it's not a major concern.
It's not a huge factor.
Because the assignments are relatively short.
Right.
And the number of students using GA
and the scale of use
is probably going to be pretty small.
It is pretty limited.
So at the end of the day, the professor decides to allow GA.
Good.
But with really clear guidelines.
With clear guidelines.
And a lot of emphasis on responsible use.
And an emphasis on...
And I think that's a really great example of how...
responsible use.
AI policy in education is not just a yes or no decision.
It's not black and white.
It's really about thinking carefully about how these tools can be used.
As an attitude loss.
And it also highlights the importance of having these conversations between educators.
We need to have
students and policymakers.
These conversations.
Because everyone needs to be on the same page.
Yeah, we need to work together.
These case studies are...
to figure this out.
Really helpful, I think.
They are.
But I'd love to...
they're really illuminating.
Zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
And think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, let's zoom out.
We've been talking about institutions. But what about the impact of AI policy on society as a whole?
Yeah, that's the...
because the choices that institutions make are going to have ripple effects.
They're going to.
Throughout society.
Impact all of us. So let's talk about that.
Let's talk about those broader implications.
Let's broaden the lens.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about AI policy for institutions.
Yeah.
But now I want to think about the bigger picture. Like, how does all of this impact society as a whole?
Right. Because ultimately, these decisions that institutions make...
the choices that institutions make are going to affect everyone.
They're going to have ripple effects throughout society.
And the paper does touch on
Yeah, the paper acknowledges that.
some of those broader societal implications.
Even though it's focused on institutions.
So when we zoom out to that societal level, what are the big questions that we need to be asking?
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns is that AI could actually deepen existing inequalities.
Oh, that's a...
it's a worry.
Scary thought.
It is.
Because if these AI systems...
if they're designed...
are designed with bias...
with bias.
Or if they're trained on data that's already biased...
or if they're trained on data that reflects existing prejudices... they could actually amplify...
it could just make those problems worse.
those inequalities across society.
And we've already seen examples of this, right?
Have.
Like AI being used in hiring.
Loan applications.
Even criminal justice.
The criminal justice system.
Yeah, it's a serious problem.
In ways that are really unfair.
It is.
To certain groups of people.
So how do we prevent that?
That's the question.
How do we make sure...
how do we ensure...
that AI is a force for good?
That AI is used to create a more just and equitable society.
That's the goal.
Not to make things worse.
So what can we do?
Well, it's going to require a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
I think we need policymakers to create regulations and guidelines that promote fairness.
So we need laws.
We need laws.
And guidelines.
That ensure AI is used responsibly.
But it's not just about laws.
No, it's also about the technology itself.
We need researchers.
We need researchers who are developing AI systems.
to be thinking about these things.
That are transparent and accountable.
So we need the technology to be designed.
Yeah, we need to be able to see how these AI systems are making decisions.
But I think you also said something really important earlier.
You need an informed public. You need people to understand.
An informed public.
How AI works.
Yeah, because people don't understand how it works.
And what the potential impacts are.
They can't really hold. Policymakers and developers accountable.
Policymakers and developers accountable.
So it's about more than just like writing laws or building better algorithms.
It's about creating a culture.
It's about
of responsible AI development.
Creating a culture of responsibility around AI.
A culture that values inclusivity.
And I think
and considers the societal impact.
A really important point.
of these technologies.
Because sometimes I think we get so caught up.
We do.
In the excitement of oh, this technology is so cool. Look what it can do.
It's shiny and new.
That we forget to ask the hard questions.
I need to ask those tough questions.
Who is this benefiting?
Yeah, who benefits?
And who could it be harming?
And who might be harmed?
So I guess the question is, do we shift the focus?
I think we create this culture
from just creating AI,
irresponsible AI development,
to creating AI that works for good.
That's the challenge.
Big challenge.
It is.
And it feels,
but it's not impossible.
Overwhelming.
No.
Like, where do we even begin?
Well, I think education and public awareness.
Tangible steps that we can take.
We need to invest in helping people understand.
So education.
How AI works, what its potential impact is.
Public awareness campaigns.
And how to engage.
Things like that.
Informed discussions about its development.
Because if people don't understand it.
Right.
They can't really
shape its future.
Have a say in how it's used.
We don't understand it. We can't control it.
And alongside education, I think we also need to talk about regulation.
We do.
Like, we need some clear...
We need clear guidelines.
Guidelines to make sure that AI is being developed and used.
To ensure that AI...
is a way that's ethical.
Is aligned with our values.
But isn't there a risk that too much regulation...
There's always that balance.
...could stifle innovation?
Yeah.
Like, how do we find that sweet spot?
It's a tough one.
Where we're encouraging progress.
It's finding that balance.
But also protecting against harm.
Yeah. It's an ongoing conversation.
It's something that policymakers...
It's something that we need to keep talking about.
I'm going to have...
As the technology evolves.
Really grapple with.
And it's going to require input.
Yeah. And I think
from a lot of different stakeholders.
It's not just policymakers.
Not just the people developing the AI. We need ethicists. Social scientists.
We need
community leaders. Everyday citizens. We all need to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, because this is going to affect everyone. And I think
we need to invest.
It's really important to emphasize
in research.
Ethical AI research.
Like, we need to be putting money.
Needs to be a priority.
Into research that's focused on.
We need to be studying
AI.
How to make AI.
Not just more powerful.
But
also more ethical.
But also more fair.
More transparent.
More fair.
More accountable. Yeah. And more beneficial to society.
Yeah. We need AI that works for good.
That's it.
This is all so important.
It is.
But I have to say, it's also really overwhelming.
It can feel that way.
Like, as an individual,
right?
What can I actually do?
Yeah, it's easy to feel powerless.
To make a difference in all of this.
In the face of such massive change.
Because it feels so big.
It does.
So what can I do?
But remember, you're not alone.
Okay.
And there are things that each of us can do.
Give you some.
Every single day.
Examples.
To contribute to a more responsible AI future.
Okay, what can I do?
First of all, stay informed.
Okay.
Read articles. Listen to podcasts.
Like this one. Educate yourself. About how AI is being developed and used.
About what's happening.
Because the more you understand...
in the world of AI...
the better equipped you'll be.
The more you'll be able to...
make informed choices.
Make informed decisions.
Okay, that's a good starting point.
Be a critical consumer. When you encounter AI in your daily life. Whether it's a recommendation algorithm... or a facial recognition system... or a customer service chatbot.
Ask questions.
Okay. How does this work? What data is it using? Could it be biased? The more we scrutinize these technologies, the more likely we are to
accept it,
identify and address potential harm.
Think about it critically.
Right.
And I think finally,
don't be afraid.
The most important thing is
to speak up.
If you see something.
If you see
something.
AI being used in a way that seems unfair.
If you see AI being used in a way.
Or harmful.
That seems unfair, biased, or harmful.
Say something.
Talk to your friends and family.
Talk to your friends. Talk to your family.
But write to your elected officials. Support organizations.
that
are working to promote.
Ethical AI. Because all of our voices matter.
Our collective voices.
You can make a difference.
So
it's really about...
It's about taking action.
Both
individually and collectively.
To create a future.
to shape a future
where AI benefits everyone.
Where AI benefits everyone.
Not just a select few.
Not just the privileged few.
This has been a really fascinating,
thought-provoking
deep dive we've talked about.
We've gone from
everything from the technical details of AI,
the nuts and bolts of AI algorithms,
to the broader societal implications.
It's a big picture.
And I feel like
I
have a much better understanding.
We all have a better understanding now
of just how complex this issue is.
How the complexity is.
And the challenge.
How much potential AI has.
But also the immense potential.
To really transform our world.
Of AI.
So thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
On this journey of exploration.
And as always.
Stay
curious.